Poker attracts all sorts of individuals. One of these individuals, Daniel Negreanu, called the C word. Las Vegas dealers called her Annie Puke. And if you ask most of the poker world, they'd say he was being polite. Annie Duke isn't just another polarizing figure in poker. She's a walking case study in opportunism. She built a reputation as one of the few female pros who could hold her own in the high-stakes world of poker. But her real skill, getting paid while everyone else got screwed. Most poker downfalls happen at the tables. Bad bankroll management, reckless decisions, or one final punt that wipes everything out. Annie Duke's downfall wasn't about losing money. It was about losing trust. Annie Duke positioned herself as a poker intellectual, a strategist, a thinker, a master of decision-making. That's the image she built, and for a while, the poker world bought into it. Her path into the game was anything but ordinary. She wasn't grinding small stakes in Las Vegas or cutting her teeth in backroom games. She was the sister of Howard Lederer, one of the biggest figures in high-stakes poker. While others were figuring things out the hard way, Duke had a direct line to insider knowledge. Lederer staked her, coached her, and set her up for success before she'd even stepped foot at the World Series of Poker. Her WSOP debut came in 1994, and she held her own. She wasn't the best player in the room, but she was good enough to be respected. The poker world was still overwhelmingly male-dominated, and Duke knew how to capitalize on being one of the few women who could actually play. Then came her biggest moment, the 2004 WSOP Tournament of Champions, a made-for-TV event with a $2 million first-place prize. It was the perfect storm for her brand.
Annie Duke has defeated 9 of the strongest poker players in the world and wins the first ever World Series of Poker Tournament of Champions.
She was beating the biggest names in poker on the biggest stage. From that point on, she wasn't just a poker personality. Someone networks could market, and she knew how to lean into it. She wrote books, she appeared on poker TV shows, she became the go-to name for media outlets that wanted a smart poker player to explain the game to the masses. But here's the reality, Duke wasn't the best poker player. She was good, sure, but she was better at selling herself than outplaying the competition. She built a reputation as a poker strategist, but when you look at her actual poker career, it wasn't defined by crushing high-stakes cash games or dominating live tournaments. It was defined by winning one big event, knowing the right people, and mastering the art of self-promotion. That's what made her so dangerous later on. She was trying to control the narrative around it, and for a while it worked. But in poker, the truth always comes out eventually. In 2011, Annie Duke pitched the Epic Poker League as poker's version of the NFL, an exclusive invite-only circuit for the best players in the world, a league with integrity, a league that would redefine the game. It sounded great on paper, a private club for poker's elite, no amateurs, no dead money, just the top pros battling it out in a carefully curated environment. The league had a strict code of conduct, banning disgraced Full Tilt execs Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson in a move meant to prove they were serious about ethics. And to top it all off, a $1 million free roll at the end of the season for the league's best performers. But poker players know better than anyone. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. From day one, the league was a financial disaster. Sponsorships never materialized, television ratings flopped, the business model relied on major funding and media deals that simply weren't there. Prize pools were guaranteed, but the money to cover them wasn't. Still, the league pushed forward. 3 events were held, the players showed up, the prize money was paid. For a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, this thing could work. Then reality hit. By the time the 4th event rolled around, the league was out of money. The promised $1 million free roll, it never happened. The entire operation collapsed into bankruptcy, defaulting on over $8 million in unpaid obligations. But here's the part that really ticked everyone off. Annie Duke got paid, the players didn't. Duke was a co-founder, a commissioner, the public face of the league. She spent the entire time talking about ethics and integrity, yet she made sure she got her cut before the ship went down. For poker players, this wasn't just another failed business venture, it was personal. They had put their trust and their money into something Duke had vouched for, and when it all went south, she walked away unscathed, unapologetic, and paid in full. At this point, Duke wasn't just disliked, she was despised. Ultimate Bet was one of the biggest scandals in online poker history. Millions stolen, players cheated out of their bankrolls, a god mode exploit that let insiders see opponents' hole cards in real time. It was a rigged game, and when the dust settled, the poker world wanted heads to roll. They got Russ Hamilton, they got a handful of accomplices, but Annie Duke, she walked away untouched. Duke had been a spokesperson for Ultimate Bet throughout the site's rise. She wasn't some clueless ambassador slapped on for branding. She actively promoted it, lending credibility to what turned out to be a long con. When the cheating scandal exploded in 2008, the poker world took inventory of who was involved and who wasn't. Duke's name was tied to Ultimate Bet, but unlike Hamilton, she never faced direct accusations. Instead, she did what she always did, distanced herself and moved on. That's what made people furious. She had been at the forefront when things were good, but when everything fell apart, she slipped out the back door with her reputation intact. There was no apology, no accountability, no attempt to make things right, just silence. And in poker, silence speaks volumes. It wasn't just the scandal that made people distrust her, it was how easily she reinvented herself after. A failed poker league, a tainted online poker site, a history of backing the wrong ventures. Yet somehow, Duke always managed to land on her feet. She wasn't taking hits at the tables. She wasn't grinding out a living like the pros who had been caught up in the mess. She was moving into something bigger, something that had nothing to do with poker at all. Poker players remember. They remembered the people who contributed to the game, and they remembered the people who used it. Duke had played poker, sure, but had she ever really been a part of it? Or was she just passing through, collecting what she could before moving on to something else? Annie Duke didn't just burn bridges in poker, she incinerated them, and if there was any lingering doubt about where she stood with the community, it disappeared the moment she reinvented herself as a decision-making expert. It wasn't the pivot itself that annoyed people. Plenty of poker players have transitioned into mainstream careers. Phil Gordon became a venture capitalist, Liv Bory turned to science and charity. Even Phil Hellmuth, for all his antics, stayed in poker but expanded into branding and business. But Duke, she didn't just pivot, she erased the past. After the collapse of the Epic Poker League, she vanished from poker entirely. No redemption arc, no attempt to fix what went wrong, no interviews addressing why millions in promised prize money never made it into players' hands. Instead, she emerged in a different world, giving TED Talks, consulting for Fortune 500 companies, and writing books on strategic thinking. The irony was impossible to ignore. A woman who had mismanaged the poker league into bankruptcy was now teaching corporations how to make better decisions. A spokesperson for one of the most scandal-ridden poker sites in history was now a voice of integrity in business. And somehow, mainstream audiences bought it. But poker players, they never forgot. While she lectured on decision-making, they remembered how she'd made sure she got paid while others got stiffed. While she spoke about rational thinking, they remembered her refusing to take accountability for Ultimate Bet.
Annie Duke is outside of poker. She's sort of rebranded herself as like this motivational speaker. And people are actually in poker get really upset when they see mainstream people talk about her in this positive light. And they're like, do you realize the scams that she was involved in? So
Daniel Negreanu never let it go. In interviews and on social media, he torched her reputation whenever the subject of ethics came up. Dealers in Vegas had allegedly given her a nickname that needed no explanation, Annie Puke. And when her books on decision-making hit the shelves, the poker world didn't see an expert. They saw someone cashing in on a version of events where her failures had been conveniently edited out. Annie Duke didn't fade out of poker. She was erased. It didn't happen all at once. There was no public ban, no dramatic scandal that forced her into exile, no teary apology tour, no desperate last attempt to stay relevant in the game. Instead, poker just collectively stopped caring, stopped acknowledging her, stopped inviting her into the conversation. And that's worse than being hated. Hated players still get remembered, they still get debated, they still get a seat at the table. Annie Duke, she got something worse than infamy. She got indifference. That's the ultimate fate of a player who takes more than they give. Poker has its villains, its controversial figures, its frauds and cheaters and egomaniacs. But even they, for the most part, have a presence in the game. Mike Postle still finds ways to pop up. Howard Lederer, despite everything, eventually reappeared in the poker world. Even Russ Hamilton, disgrace beyond repair, is still talked about when discussing the Ultimate Bet scandal. But Duke, she doesn't exist in poker anymore. You won't see her in high-stakes tournaments. You won't find her making appearances in poker broadcasts or giving insight on the modern game. Even casual fans struggle to remember the last time her name was relevant in poker. Because in poker, your reputation is everything. Your word at the table, your history in the game, the way people talk about you when you're not in the room. Annie Duke's downfall wasn't just about failed business ventures or shady affiliations, it was about the fact that, in the end, poker decided it didn't need her. And once poker doesn't need you, you don't get to come back. But not everyone in poker gets that kind of quiet exit. Some downfalls are louder, messier. Some players go from the top of the world to scrambling for buy-ins in backroom games. And if you want to see what a very different kind of poker downfall looks like, then you need to hear about Jamie Gold, a man who won the biggest main event in history and then somehow managed to lose it all.